Hi, everybody, and welcome to all of you, and especially to our speaker today, Chloë Taylor, to the fourth event on animality, colonialism, and disability of the conversation series on animal justice and animal politics. For those of you who don't know me yet, I am Pablo Perez Castelló, a junior fellow of the Animals and Biodiversity program at the Global Research Network think tank, and I am also the chair of this conversation series on animal justice and animal politics. Before we begin, I want to say a few things about the format of the conversation, and also a little bit about the story of this event, because it's slightly unusual compared to our previous events. So as many of you will know, because I know many people registered on LinkedIn and Facebook and so on, this event was meant to happen in October, but we had to postpone it for multiple reasons on more than one occasion. And it was also going to happen with Kelly Struthers-Montfort, who agreed to also participate with Chloë in this conversation. They have edited, as I will explain in a second, several books on these topics of disability, animality, and carcerality as well, and colonialism. But unfortunately, Kelly was not able to join us today. It's a real shame, but I'm sure we will have a great chat with Chloë as well. The topics that we are going to touch on today, as the title says, colonialism, disability, and animality, but we will also discuss the notion of carceral logics as well. Chloë has been doing a lot of work recently on this, and it's very related. Sid was telling me, Pablo, is so related as well to what we are looking at in relation to colonialism, especially, and so on. So we should perhaps also touch on this. So we are going to look at the colonial role of factory farming as well in relation to carceral logics, and also we will also see some questions related to the field of critical animal studies. So that's more or less what we are going to cover today. And with that out of the way, just let me introduce our speaker properly. Chloë Taylor is a professor of women's and gender studies at the University of Alberta. She's the author of 3 monographs and the co-editor of 5 books. Most recently, she and Kelly Struthers-Montfort have co-edited Building Abolition, Decarceration and Social Justice, which was published in 2021. Disability and Animality, Perspectives in Critical Animal Studies, and Colonialism and Animality, Anti-Colonial Perspectives in Critical Animal Studies. Chloë is currently completing a co-authored book with Kelly Struthers-Montfort as well, entitled Abnormal Appetites, Agricultural Power, Food Politics, and Anthropocene, which will be published in 2023 with McGill Queen's University Press. And this is also beginning work on a new edited volume, The Routledge Companion to Gender and Animals. She's also writing her 4th monograph, Intersections of Animality, and is in the early stages of projects on zoonosis and extinction. Chloë and Vasil Stanescu co-founded the North American Association for Critical Animal Studies. And well, that's pretty much everything. But I mean, Chloë, when I was reading today, again, your sort of biography, was thinking, my goodness, how can you write so many books and edit so many collections? It's so impressive. But anyways, thank you very much for being with us, and welcome again, Chloë.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your patience as we've had to change the time and date so many times.
Not at all, it's totally fine, don't worry. It's great that you're here. So then, let me begin with the first question, because we have quite a bit of ground to cover. So, in your work, Chloë, you have argued that there are connections between the oppressions of more than human animals and that of people with disability and Aboriginal peoples. And the field of critical animal studies, one of its main features is that it is very intersectional. However, there have been critiques in relation to making comparisons and analogies between the oppression experienced by traditionally oppressed human groups and the oppression experienced by animals. This has been it has happened a lot in the field, but we've also been criticizing it from the field in itself as well. So I just was wondering whether you could, how would you respond to this potential objection if someone was thinking about it before we even begin the discussion?
Right. So a lot of critical animal studies scholars doing intersectional work, such as Maneesha, Lena, Alexis, have argue that we shouldn't make comparisons between animals and oppressed groups of people, such as people of color or disabled people, in the form of, like, when animal advocates will say animal lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, or if we think of those really offensive PETA ads that visually juxtapose the Holocaust or images of slavery and images of animal oppression. And that's been argued by numerous intersectional critical animal studies scholars to be a bad strategy and offensive for a number of reasons. And first of all, in many ways, these comparisons are wrong, that there are important differences between the oppressions in question. And so that's always a problem with comparisons, is this risk of homogenizing and masking over significant differences. So there's that problem. And there's for instance, if we think about comparing factory farms to the Holocaust, right? There's a big difference there in that factory farms mass produce these animals as well as slaughter them, and that wasn't going on with concentration camps. It wasn't about mass producing as well as mass killing, right? So there's just significant historical differences between these things that are being compared. And so there's that problem. And then another, perhaps the problem that we think about or hear about the most, is that there's a danger of these comparisons being harmful, of doing material harm to the groups of humans in particular who are being compared to animals, and that animals are so denigrated in our society that anything that we do that reinforces comparisons between animals and oppressed groups of humans can reify or further the oppression of those groups of people. So, like, people of color are oppressed through comparisons of animals. And so to do anything to sort of reinforce that comparison can be harmful. So there's that problem. And then third, there's the problem, Maneesha Deckha says, it's not necessary. We don't need to do this. And we have other strategies. We have other ways that we can make these arguments, and it's not even useful. I think it's Claire Jean Kim has made that argument. I think she even made it in the conversation that you had with her earlier, that this alienates people from animal advocacy. So when animal advocates are always going around saying, animal oppression is like the Holocaust, or it's like slavery, or animal lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, that just pisses a lot of people off and makes them hate animal activists, right? So it's just not a good strategy if we want to be building coalitions and getting more people on board. And so I think, though, that doesn't mean we can't do intersectional work. We just have to do intersectional work that addresses where we're not saying, like, people of color are like animals, or disabled people are like animals, or even saying the experiences are the same, but rather where we are paying attention to the ways that ableist discourses make those comparisons, and racist discourses make those comparisons, and settler colonial discourses make those comparisons, where Indigenous people are being compared to animals, disabled people are being compared to animals, people of color are being compared to animals, women are being compared to animals, right? So we can attend to the ways that these forms of oppression are building on each other, or where the logic of ableism is speciesist, or the logic of speciesism is ableist, and we're attending to the interconnections between these forms of oppression, rather than comparing those groups of people, or these groups of people and groups of animals and their experiences, if that makes sense. So I think that's really in the intersectional works that Kelly and I have published, the colonialism and animality and disability and animality. We're not aiming to say disabled people are like animals, or Indigenous people are like animals, but rather to look at the ways that the logics of settler colonialism rely on speciesism, the ways that the logics of ableism are speciesist, and the way that speciesism is ableist, and so forth. And so those are the kinds of phenomena that we're interested in those works.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive first response, Chloe. Yes, what you were saying also reminded me when you were saying that it can also have material consequences for these oppressed human groups. Bénédicte Boisseron has also, in Afrodog, she also discusses this topic and says that one of the problems as well is that it becomes as it were, when one is making an analogy, the possibility to sort of produce a kind of race to see who is the last, and kind of a competition to see what oppression is more important, then it's on the table. As opposed to if one understands that these oppressions are co-constituted and that we need to attend to how these forms of oppression are intersecting and so on, that's really what we should be concerned with, not merely with, you know, as soon as we create an analogy, we say, well, they are two different oppressions that are completely separated, as it were, when we put them in terms of being co-constituted and we remove the idea of making analogies, then I think it kind of, we look at the oppression in a different way. And I think her work in this respect of Bénédicte Boisseron, Afrodog, is also very interesting. And related with this, actually, it's very close to the next question, because the idea now would be to kind of try to understand a little bit for people who might not be familiar with how all these oppressions are intersecting, or they are co-constituting each other and so on. So my question would be, could you tell us a little bit, for those who are not familiar with this literature, in what way the idea that the oppression of human animals, people with disabilities, and Aboriginal peoples intersect? Like, can you tell us a little bit about this, why that's the case?
Chloë Taylor has made this argument really compellingly about disability and animal oppression in her wonderful book, Beasts of Burden. She discusses how disabled people are very often denigrated for not having species typical abilities. So for instance, they don't move around or use their bodies or talk like normative humans, or they don't reason the way normate humans do. And they're often compared to animals because of this. So she describes how she herself as a child was often told and, you know, insulted that she walked like a monkey. And that's something that Eli Clare also has talked about, is how as a child he was mocked for being like a monkey. And also she talks about being, you know, told she eats like a dog because she doesn't eat, you know, holding utensils in her hands, but will eat directly with her mouth from the plate. And so she gets compared to animals. And of course, she's an animal lover. So part of her reaction, even as a child, was like, what's wrong with that? But she knows that that's meant to be hurtful. It hurts because it's meant to be hurtful. And that's because of the pre-existing denigration of animals. So ableism often relies on speciesism in this way, that you're compared to an animal and you're oppressed because you're like an animal, but that presupposes the oppression of animals. That is a bad thing to be like an animal. And so the other side of that coin is that non-human animals are denigrated because they're perceived to lack species typical human abilities, such as language or reason or bipedal perambulation, the ability to walk around on two legs. So speciesism is a kind of ableism in that way. It says that non-human animals are inferior to humans because they lack the abilities that humans have, by which we mean species typical humans have, right? Able-bodied, able-minded people have. So the same logic that says certain people, disabled people, are inferior because they lack species typical abilities also says that all animals are inferior to humans because they lack these same abilities. So animals are seen as having more moral worth the more their abilities are close to ours. So animals that we can recognize as having reason similar to ours, they can solve problems, they can get out of mazes and that kind of thing. Or animals that we can recognize them as communicating and having language or having culture, so dolphins and primates and so on, then their moral status is elevated because they have abilities closer to ours. So we see that this is a kind of ableism that's embedded in speciesism. So I think that's the best argument that I've seen is in Chloë Taylor's work for how both we can talk about ableism as speciesist and speciesism as ableist. And for colonialism and speciesism, there's a very explicit history of saying that Indigenous people are closer to non-human animals than Europeans. And we see variations on these discourses with respect to other groups of oppressed people. And these variations are important, but very often we see that some form of speciesism underpins interhuman oppression. So So in the case of Indigenous people, for instance, in Canada, there were really explicit discourses on the part of settlers saying Indigenous people live in the forest like wolves, and they were in the process of trying to exterminate the wolves because the wolves preyed on their agricultural animals. And so it was really explicit that Indigenous people are like wolves, and so we can exterminate them in the same way that we are killing off the wolves, that we're also an Indigenous species, in order to protect, to make space for Europeans on this land and to make space for European animals on this land. So we can see it's not to say that Indigenous people are like wolves, but just to point out that these colonial discourses made that comparison and justified oppression on those grounds.
Yes, I also, when you were saying the example on the mouth by Chloë Taylor, it's something that I thought a bit about, and I really like this idea because Chloë Taylor also says that she picks up objects with her mouth when she was in a cafe and she's writing bits of burden and she's picking up, and she says in a way that she's destabilizing the norm, deconstructing the idea that the mouth is to speak. Which is of course an ableist notion, isn't it? And it's very, I think it's super interesting. I really recommend people to read Beasts of Burden. It's a fantastic book that discusses these matters at length. Now, the question that I wanted to ask now is related in part to Virginia Anderson's Creatures of Empire, where she argues that animal agriculture was part of Europeans' colonial project and civilizing mission, which is in part what you were touching on at the end of your previous response. And in your with your co-editor, Kelly Struthers-Montfort as well, in the chapter Towards a Theory of Multi-Species Carcerality in the Colonialism and Animality book. And also, Kelly also wrote on this matter in Land Agriculture and the Carceral, an article of hers. She argues that, Kelly, that colonial governments positioned, I'm quoting Kelly here, colonial governments positioned the institution of animal agriculture, sedentary housing, and private property relationships to land and animals as a manner of, quote, transforming an Indian into a white man in sentiment. And they say, quote again at the end, because this last bit is, it appears in the report of the Department of Indian Affairs in 1891. Kelly was studying these texts in that piece of hers. So what I want to ask you, Chloë, is whether you could explain what is the role, or what has the role of animal agriculture been, or what role has it played as a civilizational tool, and the influence of animal agriculture in our current understanding of legal property in the so-called, Western countries? Because I think it's played a very important role, hasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that the animals that we primarily eat in North and South America today, so cows and pigs and chickens, are not indigenous to the Americas, and they were all brought over by European settlers who wanted to reproduce the sort of pastoral settings, the farms and foods of Europe that they were used to in the so-called New World. And Indigenous people were seen as not using the land, and the idea was that God intended people to be using the land and to be making it fruitful, by which was understood using it to graze cattle, very specifically, because Indigenous people were actually already clearing forests, burning down forests, and planting lots of plant crops. And they had a huge variety of plant crops. So there was lots of agriculture going on before settlers came, but it was plant agriculture, and there weren't domesticated animals or animals as property, with the exception of dogs. There was some domestication of dogs, and there was, I guess, some use of turkeys were indigenous to the Americas, and there was some use of their feathers, but not really, they were not being, farmed for meat. And so it was the fact that Indigenous people were not, fencing in land to graze cattle, and there weren't cattle here anyway in North and South America. So that was seen as they're not using the land, and that was the justification to seize it, right, to steal the land. So there's this very clear way that animal agriculture was used to justify the theft of land. And when land was fenced off in order to become grazing land for European cattle, Indigenous people lost their hunting grounds, and the animals that they hunted in those grounds were driven off and killed off in order to make space for the cattle and the pigs and the chickens. And the European cattle was allowed to destroy Indigenous people's plant crops. And if Indigenous people killed the European cattle to protect their crops, they could be killed. And so they were basically driven off their lands, lost their hunting grounds, lost their agricultural land, and confined to reservations that were in the worst, in general, in the worst locations that wasn't fertile for agriculture. And so they're deprived of being able to hunt or to grow food, and to, so they're on the brink of starvation. And then there was an arrangement that if they would bring the settlers X number of wolf scalps, they would get a steer or a cow in return. So and the reason settlers wanted them to kill the wolves was to protect the cattle and cows. So Indigenous people were paid in cattle to kill the wolves, right? And that which they did as a way to have food. So to start dairying and having cattle and getting food that way. And so they were kind of forced into dairying and animal agriculture in that way. So there was a kind of food colonialism there, a kind of assimilation of Indigenous people into eating foods that were not traditional for them at all. And in fact, most Indigenous people are lactose intolerant. So that was very difficult, it continues to be difficult on their bodies, but that they had few other choices than to do this. So all of that is discussed as cattle colonialism. And in Kelly's article that you referenced, she also discusses prison farms. That is, prisons are on stolen Indigenous land, and then they mass incarcerate Indigenous people through laws that are settler laws that Indigenous people never consented to. And these lands are stolen in the first place with this justification of animal agriculture. And then they actually have farms within these prison grounds. And this is today really extensively done in the US. In Canada, there was a period where prison farms were a thing, and it kind of, I think it stopped, and now it's being reintroduced. And Kelly knows a lot more about that than I do. But in the US, it's a really big thing. And there are prisons that have not one, but two factory farms within the prison grounds. They'll have a pig factory farm and a chicken factory farm, for instance, and all the slaughtering takes place there. And in Canada, where prison farms are being reintroduced, and so there's like a debate about, is this a good thing? It's often described as this is something really rehabilitative for prisoners. And these are, violent people who have led this criminal life. And of course, this isn't true. But the sort of perception of prisoners is that they are these violent people who have led these bad lives, and that doing farming will be this kind of pastoric, idyllic work that will be rehabilitative and therapeutic for them. But what they're doing is, slaughtering animals for a large part. And we know that slaughterhouse work is criminogenic. So when you're slaughtering animals all day and doing this really violent work, it desensitizes you to violence. And areas where slaughterhouses are introduced, the rates of domestic violence go up, for instance. So people who are doing this violent work all day go home and are violent in their communities and violent in their families. So it's this really kind of ironic thing that in Canada, there's this promotion of let's go back to having prison farms, let's have prisoners do farm work because it's going to be rehabilitative, when we know it is actually criminogenic. But anyways, Kelly and her work just sort of explores the many layers of irony and oppression here.
Yes, I only wanted to add, because I think it's a very important piece as well, that because some of our members of the audience, they come from the field of animal law. And one book that was released recently, Wildlife as Property Owners by Karen Bradshaw. In that book, one of the things that happens, and I think this is interesting because of the notion of legal property and what you were discussing, is that in that book, Bradshaw argues that indigenous peoples, as it were, they have pretty much the same understanding of property or relationship to land as Westerners, as it were, European settlers have. And I think one of the reasons why that happens is because it seems that there is not an understanding of a lot of the things that you mentioned here about how the relationship of many people to land changed in the US because the Europeans began fencing and kind of transported this understanding of property that we had in European countries. And as you say as well, of course, cattle and all this industry, all these animals, they were not native or indigenous to the Americas. I mention this because it's so easy to fall into the erasure of forms of knowledge and relationships to land and animals and the more than human world, because we just see it with our sort of Western lens. And I think this piece by Kelly, I would really recommend people to read it, and also Virginia Anderson's Creatures of Empire is very helpful to be able to then deconstruct a little bit these other works that perhaps are eliding the differences that there clearly are, I think, between indigenous understandings of land and more Western understandings of land and animals and earth that is more, based on an understanding of we own it, we can use it, and that's it. In building abolition, Kelly and you, Chloë, you both write in the introduction that prison abolition is decolonization. You say, I'm quoting you here. And I wonder whether you could unpack this argument, because when I read it, I thought, I was quite unfamiliar, I must admit, with all the literature in carcerality. And I thought this is very important and kind of, in some ways, groundbreaking. I suppose in the literature this is quite clear, but I had never thought about it seriously. It's a field I have never explored. So could you unpack this argument and tell us why prison abolition is a kind of decolonial project, perhaps?
Just briefly, I would recommend Karen Morin's book on carceral spaces, where she talks about factory farms and other spaces where animals are kept captive as carceral spaces, and she thinks about them in conjunction with prisons where human beings are incarcerated. So I'd recommend that book. But to more specifically respond to your question about why is prison abolition decolonization, I'd reference a work by Robert Nichols called The Colonialism of Incarceration, where he makes the point that although all the arguments for prison abolition that exist when we think about other groups of oppressed people who are mass incarcerated, so African Americans, for instance, and Hispanic people in the United States and immigration detention centers, trans people are also highly likely to be incarcerated, poor people, people with cognitive disabilities, people with mental health diagnoses. So in all these cases, we talk about them being these groups being overrepresented in prisons. And Nichols problematizes that language of overrepresentation as though if only we incarcerated white, able-bodied, able-minded people at the same rates, everything would be okay. But there's all kinds of problems with prisons that exist, whether or not, whatever the representation is. But he argues that in addition to all those arguments still standing, when we think about the mass incarceration of Indigenous people, there's an additional kind of normative argument that can be made against the incarceration of Indigenous people, or an additional argument for prison abolition that can be made from an anti-colonial perspective, which is that these institutions are located on stolen land and that Indigenous people are being incarcerated through legal systems that they never consented to. So many scholars have examined the ways that mass incarceration of Indigenous people is used as a tool of settler colonialism. So in Canada, for instance, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, began as a paramilitary organization to crush Indigenous resistance to settlement. And it's never really changed. Like the fundamental purpose of the RCMP has never really changed. It's still first and foremost about suppressing Indigenous sovereignty in Canada. So Lisa Gunther has talked about prisons in Canada and the US as eugenic institutions, in that they are sex segregated institutions that prevent the biological but also the social reproduction of the groups of people that they mass incarcerate. So those are just, which are primarily people of color and Indigenous people. So those are some of the ways that decolonization and decarceration are intimately connected. And something Kelly has been interested in is how the stolen land got stolen in the first place, through these arguments for animal agriculture being the proper use of the land. And then in some cases you have animal agriculture situated within the prisons. And she's also interested in the ways that prisons reinforce the normalization of animal-based diets, because she has discussed in interviews with prisoners about the impossibility of accessing plant-based diets within prisons.
Thank you very much for that response, Chloe. One notion or one concept that when I was reading your work, I thought, this is very interesting. I think we should really touch on this. I don't know if it's yours or it's by someone else, but it's the notion of de-animalization that you've written about this with Kelly as well. And again, it's kind of as well touching or explaining these interconnections and these intersections between carcerality, animal agriculture, and violence against those groups that are not civil and they are not white and so on. So could you tell us as well a bit about this notion of de-animalization, please?
Yeah, that term actually comes from Lisa Gunther's book, Solitary Confinement, Social Death and Its Afterlives. And Lisa is a feminist philosopher who works in the area of phenomenology. And before moving to Nashville, she was a professor at Vanderbilt for a long time. And before moving there, she was doing work on animals. But then when she moved to Nashville, she started teaching in maximum security men's prison, and actually teaching men who were on death row and men who were in solitary confinement or had spent a lot of their lives in solitary confinement. And so she sort of shifted from working on animals to working on solitary confinement and critical prison studies. But there's one chapter in that book, her book, Solitary Confinement, where she talks about animals and this frequently made argument that prisons are dehumanizing, that prisons treat prisoners like animals. So, but the book begins by sort of looking at the psychological studies of what solitary confinement does to human prisoners, and that it basically makes people go mad, and that very quickly when you're kept in solitary confinement, you are undone, and just that people will go mad in solitary confinement. And she also, though, shows that in that chapter on animals in the book, she talks about the ways that non-human animals are undone in the same way, that they are driven mad in the exact same ways when they are put in similar conditions of isolation. So as in laboratory cages and factory farm cages and zoos and so on, we can think about, tigers and zoos who are kept in like a concrete space all by themselves, and the kind of pacing and the sort of self-mutilation that animals do in factory farms and those kinds of behaviors. We see really similar things happening with animals kept in these conditions as we see with humans kept in solitary confinement. And sometimes prisons are oppressive in that you have no solitude. And we can think about these prison cells that are designed for 2 people, where you have 4 prisoners kept in them and they're overcrowded and there's no privacy and there's no solitude. And then other people are being kept in solitary confinement, right? And that's actually even worse, right? Even everything that's terrible about overcrowding, you're actually more likely to go mad if you're put in solitary confinement. But there are similar things that can be said about factory farms and other, sites of confinement for animals. In some cases, they're overcrowded. We can think about, chickens that are thousands, or in a barn, or that are so many chickens in one little cage. But then we can also think about the sow in the farrowing crate, who's all can't even have real contact with her own piglets, or we can think of the veal all alone in a veal crate. So we have these two extremes as well in our treatment of animals, especially in factory farming, that in some cases they are overcrowded, and that is terrible and maddening. But in other cases, and this seems to be even worse, they are totally isolated, and they are also undone by that isolation and go mad in the same ways that humans do. And so it's in that context that she considers this argument that prisons treat humans like animals, they treat human prisoners like animals, and that they're dehumanizing. And she's asked, like, in what, that presupposes that these are normal ways to treat animals, and that these are proper treatments for animals. But in fact, they undo animals in the exact same way that they undo humans. And the kind of question that motivates a lot of her book is, what does it say about human subjectivity that we are undone by isolation? It shows that we fundamentally require a certain kind of sociality, and it seems that we need sociality with conspecifics. We need to interact with other humans, and so there's studies showing, in solitary confinement, it helps if there's a mouse in your cell, but it's not the same. And it helps to be able to have some form of communication, like phone or video, but it's not the same as having in-person contact with another human. And there similar kinds of things can be said about other animals, that there's something fundamental to them that they need in-person contact, socialization with conspecifics. So that's the context when she argues that we shouldn't talk about prisons as dehumanizing, but as de-animalizing, because the same conditions undo animals as they undo humans. And so it's not in virtue of our humanity that solitary confinement undoes us. It's in virtue of our animality, because the same thing happens to other animals. And so it's not that these spaces aren't proper to humans, that they undo us as humans, but they undo us more fundamentally as animals, and they undo other animals as well. So that's a term, de-animalization, that comes from Lisa's work, and Kelly especially has taken up that term a lot in her own work.
Yes, what you mentioned about the importance of humans relating to mice or some of the animals when they are in solitary confinement, it reminded me to this article by, the author is called Zevnik in Long Critique. There is this piece, I was looking for it now, called Becoming Animal, Becoming Detainee, Encountering Human Rights Discourse in Guantanamo. And he explains that what was happening to Guantanamo prisoners, and the fact that they could not even speak to the humans that would give them food and things like that. It was not allowed for them. And that the animals, because this person kind of checks some interviews and stuff, and deconstructs it and tries to understand what was happening. For them, it was saying, for us, it was crucial to be able to relate to some animals, and we just wanted to have the rights that dogs had, they said, because the dogs had a shelter, they had a place to sleep, the dogs that were guard dogs or something, while they didn't even have a roof. So it reminded me a lot what you were explaining to that article as well. And I was also glad to, I was not glad because it's really sad, but the issue of maddening and madness connects a lot with our next question, that you touched on it on multiple occasions, because of solitary confinement for both animals and humans. It's a kind of maddening experience. People really lose themselves, as it were. I mentioned this because, of course, you wrote this wonderful chapter. I really enjoyed reading your chapter, Vegan Madness, which appears in the book Disability and Animality that I have referred to that book several times already. And the quote is, of course, very related to the notion of madness. And I say this because madness structures a foundational concept of colonialism, that is the notion of civility. Civility is defined by opposition to madness. And so I want to read this long quote of yours that I think it's really telling, and I would really like you to, explain it. You say, Chloe, in your chapter, Vegan Madness, Nietzsche is said to have become unhinged when he witnessed a collapsed horse being beaten by a carriage driver. In response to the scene, Nietzsche began yelling at the driver, getting in the way of the whip by hugging the horse's neck, whispering to the horse and whipping. He was arrested by the police and placed in a sanatorium for this disturbance of the peace. A peace that was never a peace for horses. From this moment onward, although he lived for another 11 years, Nietzsche stopped speaking. And you say, Chloë, you continue on to say, if it is mad to refuse to eat meat, to intervene in the whipping of a horse, to scream and to weep over the violence that humans inflict on animals, to hug and to talk to animals but refuse to speak to humans, or to want to be a plant. If violence is what being an animal means, then I am with the mad, you say quite provocatively. The quote ends there. When I read this, I thought this is such a powerful passage, and I really wanted you could elaborate on it, explain a little bit to us. How did you, even I was also thinking genealogically, how did Chloë end up thinking this? Because I thought it was fantastic. So yes, please, can you tell us a little bit about this quote?
Well, it's in a chapter where I'm talking about Han Kang's book, The Vegetarian, which I really love. So for people who haven't read the book, it begins with a woman who beforehand was, she's described as a very normal woman, and her husband married her because she's so normal. And part of her normalcy is that she can gut a fish, and she squashes cockroaches with her hands, and she's a great cook, and everything she cooks is meat, meat, meat. And so but then she has this dream of violence and something involving animals and lots of blood. And she wakes up in the night after having this dream and instantly becomes vegan. And she, like, in the middle of the night goes and like empties all the meat out of the fridge and the freezer and throws it out. And it's like, after that, will not eat meat and will not cook meat, and doesn't want to have sex with her husband because he's still consuming meat, and so his body sort of smells from meat and so on. And so that's how it begins. But she also stops speaking, and eventually she stops eating altogether, and she at a certain point is institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital, and she identifies as a plant. And that's her sort of explanation for not eating, is that she's a plant, and so all she needs is sun and light and can photosynthesize, and she doesn't need food. And so she's, considered insane, and she's force-fed, but unsuccessful. She's very resistant to being force-fed, and she, at the end of the book, she's dying of starvation, and the implication is that she's going to die. So some critical animal studies scholars have read the book and argued that she's not mad, that it is the meat-eating society that around her that is mad, and that's wanting to sort of, she's pathologized for her veganism, and so some critical animal studies scholars have wanted to sort of defend her as not mad in order to kind of, I think, defend veganism as not a crazy thing. We're not over, often vegans are pathologized, and this is something that I've written about in other works, is, diagnoses such as anti-vivisection syndrome and even orthorexia nervosa, and these various psychiatric diagnoses that have existed in the 19th and 20th and even 21st century that pathologize vegans. And so I think there's a kind of impulse to defend the protagonist in Han Kang's The Vegetarian and say she's not mad. In fact, it's the meat-eating society that's mad. But there's a kind of saneism there to want to, whenever with disability in general, when people say I'm not disabled, or they take their medical condition and say that's not a disability, I'm not disabled. And the same with when we say I'm not mad, I'm not crazy. We can understand why people want to make that move, because disability is so stigmatized and mental illness is so stigmatized. So to want to distance ourselves from that, but of course we reinforce that stigma, that oppression of people with the disability and mental illness labels when we distance ourselves from it. And there is, I think, a critique to be made within critical animal studies of saneism and ableism. like we can think about Gary Francione's phrase, moral schizophrenia, for instance. So ways where vegans and animal activists have often been pathologized and seen as crazy, but we've also turned around and said, no, you're crazy. And, you know, in particular, you have moral schizophrenia. And to say it's actually the dominant society's attitudes towards animals and the dominant society's meat eating that is pathological. And while I understand those arguments, what I'm wary of is the ableism, the Satanism there. So I was trying in that passage to find a way to say, I am with the protagonist in this story, and she's the one I understand, and she's the one I am in solidarity with, without disavowing her madness, without saying, oh, she's not crazy, it's the other people, it's the meat eaters, it's the other people in the book that are crazy.
Yes, that also was making me think that if one kind of tries to establish that the norm is veganism and the non-norm is non-veganism or whatever, what the problem with this would be, of course, that the kind of category of madness would still serve the purpose of exclusion. You are still creating a divide between, you know, those who are not mad and those who are mad, and the ones who are not mad are outside the circle of, you know, and then we just exclude them. You know, they're ill, as a matter of fact, right? So this, instead of, which is something that comes from disability studies and many other fields, try to, I'm not saying that one should embrace, you know, meat eating or anything like that, but try to embrace difference and diversity and different ways of being, which I think kind of displacing this dichotomy is much more productive than just continuing to reproduce this kind of epistemology, knowledge system that it's very, very harmful in many instances. Yes, and the last kind of couple of questions that I would like to ask you, Chloe, are more related to the field of critical animal studies. And I like to ask this question to different speakers. But in your case, I really wanted to ask you this question because you've co-edited a volume on animality and disability, animality and colonialism. Now you're working on one on gender and animals as well. Also the one on building abolition in relation to carceral logics, right? So it's just, if there is an intersectional scholar in critical animal studies to whom I can ask this question and get a good answer, I think that's probably you. So what I was thinking as well when I was reading some of your works and these edited collections that you have co-edited was that there are no edited collections of this kind in the 80s, in the 90s, and not even in the early 2000s. Like the intersectional kind of work that you've been doing, especially and other people, not you exclusively, of course, in the 2010s, I think it's been by and large absent previously, at least in the previous century, let's say. Of course, there is the exception of ecofeminism. I think ecofeminist scholars have done a lot of that work, and they began working on these things in the 80s and the 90s. So there is that exception there. But by and large, animal rights theory and animal ethics as well has been oblivious to this kind of intersectional work. Animal studies, I suppose, in the 2000s, it already began a little bit doing this work. But clearly, I mean, it is very clear because we don't have an animals and disability from the year 2000 or from the year 1990. So what I wanted to ask is, why has that happened? Why has it taken us perhaps quite a bit of time, several decades, to begin to ask these questions and kind of put the focus on these intersections? We had ecofeminists there doing a lot of that work, but there was still a lot of other things to do, and it was not there. And still now in some spaces, it's a bit difficult to kind of introduce some of these intersectional ideas, at least in my experience. There is some resistance in some fields. So if you could tell us a little bit, why do you think that happened before? And why do you think that we are where we are now? Because it seems that at least people like you and a lot of other people in critical animal studies are really trying to focus on these intersections and to think at once all these problems, as Claire Jenkins says. We need to kind of think at once all these things and have this multidimensional kind of understanding of oppressions constantly, right? When we analyze and make proposals and so on. So yes, that's basically my question. Perhaps too long of a question.
I'm glad, though, that you continually qualified your question with referencing ecofeminism, because, as you said, there was really important work. I mean, Carol Adams' Sexual Politics of Need, I think is 1990. So even the 80s, the 90s, there was significant work being done that's intersectional, but primarily looking at the intersection of gender and speciesism, gender oppression and species oppression. And it's true now we see much more intersectional work, and even someone like Carol Adams' work today, you know, moves much more beyond gender. If I'm thinking about the volume on ecofeminism that Carol Adams and Laurie Gruen edited, that's now, I don't know if it's already come out or is coming out in its second edition, and you know, and Chloë Taylor has contributed to that on disability, and Patrice Jones on a queer perspective, and so on. So there's work on race, and there's so much more intersectional than just looking at the intersection of gender and animals. So yeah, you're right, though today there's much more of that work, and I think of AFCO and Silco's work, and you mentioned Bénédicte Boisseron's work, Claire Jean Kim's work, I've mentioned Chloë Taylor's work, Dinesh Wadawal's work. There's so much exciting work being done in critical animal studies that's intersectional, and so why now? And I don't have a really interesting answer, I think, to that. It's more, I just think that within feminism, intersectionality has become very much the norm, and it's, you know, since the 90s. And so that it's actually required in feminism now. And so my training is in philosophy, and in philosophy, it's possible, I think, to work on animals and just, you know, like Peter Singer and Tom Regan, and just be concerned about animals and maybe make analogies like speciesism is like racism. And, you know, so they bring in race and gender and racism, sexism as analogies, but without really thinking in an intersectional way, not just how is speciesism like racism, but how does it interlock with and co-constitute animality and race and so on. So, you know, they're not doing intersectional work like we're seeing today. And in philosophy, it's possible to just work on animals without thinking much about humans, the interlocking with human oppressions. But at a certain point in my career, I started transitioning from philosophy into women's and gender studies, where intersectionality is just the absolute norm. And so I think that probably really influenced my approach to, I was interested in animals since I was in philosophy. And as I transitioned into women's and gender studies and my own work became more and more intersectional, it just seemed natural to approach my work on animals and my work on food in this intersectional way.
One of the answers that I have for this question, because it's a question I thought about quite a bit, and it's related to my working part, it's that, at least under my understanding, and people like Maneesha Deckha, Matthew Calarco, and also Silco and AFCO have also discussed this. One of the problems with focusing on speciesism rather than anthropocentrism is that the speciesism would seem to say, well, we are discriminating because there is here a difference of a species. The human species is superior to all other species, and that's why we discriminate. While what people that focus on anthropocentrism seem to be trying to argue is that, well, that's really an analytic kind of, it's mistaken slightly to think that the reason is the species. The reason is what a lot of scholars in law, but in other fields, call this idea of the paradigmatic human person as an able-bodied, rational, independent man who is civil and all that stuff. Because then what one sees is that the oppression is not targeting really a species. It targets all those beings who deviate from this ideal, the mad, women, people who are not, don't follow heteronormative kind of frameworks, and so on. And I of course, there is also probably something about the species, especially in the law, that this is super clear, for example. So I wouldn't want to just say, there is nothing to discuss or to think about in relation to species. But perhaps because there was not this focus on, because the notion of the human as this paradigmatic human person really opens up all the intersections and opens up how everything is kind of co-constituted. While the speciesism, as you were saying, leads us to the analogy issue here, and to think that it is just like racism, it is just like sexism. It doesn't kind of impel us or leads us to think in this more intersectional manner. But just, who knows? We can never know really why things end up being as they are. But yes, it's fantastic that the field now is where we are, I think, I think it's going in a direction that I'm quite happy with. And related to that, I wanted to ask you precisely, where do you see the field of critical animal studies going? And what topics or what issues do you think that we should focus on? So one is perhaps more realistic, or trying to see where are we going, and the other one is where should we go, perhaps?
Well, I think something that we're living in an age of mass extinction, right? So people have argued that we're in the 6th mass extinction. So I think that's a very important issue for critical animal studies scholars to be considering. And then we're living during this pandemic. So I think thinking about zoonoses, and I think, right, we're just going to keep having these pandemics, and these pandemics are zoonotic, and the genesis of these pandemics and epidemics are in the oppression of animals, right? Taking over their habitats, factory farming, wet markets, whatever it is, their animal oppression is at the root of these pandemics and epidemics that we're experiencing now, and we're going to keep experiencing more of. So I think that's a really important issue for critical animal studies scholars to be considering. And I mean, we can think about so many ways that animals have been at stake in this pandemic, not just in how the pandemic began and how future pandemics are going to begin, but also animal experimentation to get the vaccines, and the impacts of lockdown on species, how we saw species coming back into spaces. And there were so many ways that we can think about, the animals that had COVID that were mass exterminated. And there's so many ways that we can think about animals in terms of the pandemic. And so I think zoonosis is an interesting topic for critical animal studies, and also the connections between animal oppression and climate change. I think climate change is, the climate change and mass extinction are the biggest issues of our time probably, and there are these connections between the two, between climate change and animal oppression. Of course, factory farming, animal agriculture in general being a major driver of climate change. So I don't really want to prescribe where, or I don't want to be a prophet and sort of predict where it's going, or be sort of prescribe where it should go. But those are 3 areas: mass extinction, zoonosis, pandemics, and climate change, that seem really important to me, and that I hope to see a lot more critical animal studies scholarship in those areas. What about you? How do you see the field going?
Well, how do I see the field going? I mean, there are so many things. I guess one of the questions that I believe we are going to be forced to confront is the question of plants, as it were. It's becoming so present everywhere. Why do we eat animals and not plants? So I think that's a question we will need to answer. And then, of course, climate change questions, I believe they have not been, especially in animal rights theory, that central. It was there, but I think it's becoming so pressing, that interconnection as well. We need to look at it very carefully, and it's already been done. I think there is a lot of wonderful work on that, and we will continue to see more. Also, because precisely we are going to see many more catastrophic events in the future. That's, as a matter of fact, that's going to happen. So I think reality will force us to. There will not be a way around it. We have to deal with what there is, and that's what we are going to have. Even though it's sad, but it's what is going to happen. I remember, Chloe, that you mentioned that at some point where you live, there was a hurricane and you were not hearing birds singing. So maybe we will begin to think about, what is that experience, right? People who are phenomenologists, they might experience things like that and begin to write about these things. But it's difficult to predict sometimes. I guess cell-based myths as well, there is more work on that, and my suspicion is there will be more work on that. And then we will have questions about Katie Gillespie and Jan They were discussing this as well. So they had written recently an article on whether sanctuary should be spaces to, take some of that meat. And Katie was saying, well, not, because really that reproduces the commodification of animals. And that's most sanctuaries that she knows, at least she was saying, their ethos goes against that kind of thing. So I believe there will be also more discussions in that respect. And yeah, all the intersectional work we've been mentioning, I think that will also be, I think it's exploding in the last 5 years or 10 years, and will continue to do so, hopefully. But I have the feeling it will. Thank you very much, Chloe, for this wonderful and fascinating discussion that we have had. I wish Kelly could have joined us, but it was still fantastic. And before closing, I just want to say a few things. So as for people who follow the series and who have watched these events before, you know that I always read a quote at the end of every event and tell you about the next events of the Animals and Biodiversity program at the Global Research Network. Unfortunately, because this event is recorded, I don't really know when the episode will be released. So I'm not sure what events I should mention, but you can always follow the GRN's social platforms on Twitter and, Facebook, and sure you are all pretty much following it. If you just type Global Research Network, Animals and Biodiversity in all these platforms, you will find it. And also the other thing that I want to say, is that the next animal conversation, which will be with Sue Donaldson, Patrice Jones, and Eva Meyer on topics related to what I like to call zoodemocratic theory, will happen like this one as well. It will be recorded also, but we will not have the usual questions and answers. But always feel free to drop me an email if you have problems accessing the conversation series to pablo.castello@protonmail.com, or to follow me on Twitter @Pablo P Castello. You can always ask me them. And because it's the last day that I will kind of do an event with them, I just want to thank the GRN, the Global Research Network. Think that for the support with the series and for giving me the opportunity to setting this series up, especially to Yoriko Otomo, the director of the think tank, and also to the people doing the work in the background, which is often invisible, but very important, Preeti and Anissa. Thank you very much for everything. And I will read indeed a quote in a second, but before I do that, Chloe, I was wondering whether you have any last words or any last thoughts, because, sometimes talking, we forget to say something, and then we remember, I would have liked to say this or the other thing. So if you have something to say, now it's the time, I suppose.
I'm good, thank you.
No, fantastic. Well, thank you, Chloe. Thank you. Today's quote is quite long. The good thing is that there is only one, and it discusses some of the things that I believe, some of the problems that underlie our discussion today in relation to how and who we construct knowledge systems. So how do we construct knowledge system, and who does that, and from what position? Because this has a decisive influence then in determining ethics. Our knowledge system is going to determine ethics, and not only ethics, but also policies, the law, human-animal relationships. And we've touched on some of these things when Chloe was referring to prison, to carceral logics. We talked about the notion of property. So here, our knowledge system is really, really important. So in this respect, the work of, Chloe was mentioning before, the work of Dinesh Waldewell in the war against animals, I think is fantastic on this. And I just want to read this quote that captures how knowledge and ethics relate to each other. And he says that when we consider our relationship to animals, that this is a quote, sovereignty, which Dinesh Waldewell understands as a form of human domination of animals, appears to precede ethics, to come before ethics. Waldewell argues that this is a problem because ethics constructed after sovereignty, after human domination, works only to mitigate the violent effects of that sovereignty, insofar as it leaves the basic structure of domination intact. This result, in other words, is welfare. We might then understand welfare as precisely an ethical action that is limited or governed by a sovereign prerogative for continuing utilization. We offer welfare to those we have dominion over and wish to continue to dominate for our own benefit, but have the freedom to provide forms of limited consideration that do not temper our dominion right. which is captured perfectly in that diabolical phrase, what Abel says, unnecessary suffering. So I think this is very related to our discussion today, because when we were talking about, for example, notions like reason and unreason, the idea of the mad, the notion of civility, dominant understandings of disability as a deprivation, or the understanding that animals are only bodies, as it were. So all that knowledge system, or those categories, are fundamentally determining our ethics and also our policies and the law and everything that we have been discussing today. So I think I will just leave it there. Chloe, once more, thank you so much for this conversation, for being with us. It's been difficult to get it done, but we've done it. So thank you very much. And Happy New Year to everybody whenever you see this. Happy New Year to all our listeners and to you too, Chloe. Bye-bye. See you soon.